Now, I'm going to walk you through a night that thought it knew itself. A room lined with microphones and red lights, a table that holds more secrets than a courtroom, and two men who've trained whole audiences to lean in. You'll hear how the first laugh came easy, how the first question didn't, and why the room forgot to breathe for a full 10 seconds before anyone dared to move. The studio wasn't loud, it was alive. Red tally lights blinked like patient beacons, cables lay in heavy loops across a floor seasoned by 1,000 conversations, and the air carried that faint mix of coffee, wood, and something intangible, expectation. At the center of it all sat Joe Rogan, hands loose but ready, eyes bright behind a warmth that had learned to double as a blade when needed. Across from him, Elon Musk, posture relaxed in the practiced way of someone who knows cameras prefer composure to confession. He had the stillness of an engineer and the restlessness of a man who could launch a car into space and still feel late for something. They said hello the way men do who've met the internet together before. Easy, almost casual, like two pilots doing a pre-flight check with a storm on the horizon. Joe cracked a small smile. Elon answered with the kind of grin that understates itself. Somewhere beyond the glass, a producer folded her arms and nodded a little to no one in particular. Everyone was doing their job. The room felt domesticated. That was the trick. Joe's voice filled the room with its familiar weight. "All right," he said, "we're live." It's a short sentence, but in this place, it's a spell. The world outside shrank. The world inside grew until it became the only one that mattered. They began with the ritual questions that keep audiences safe during the first miles. Rockets, reusability, math you can almost feel. Elon talked about mass and margins like somebody describing a mountain no one else could see. Joe asked about thrust the way a fighter asks about footwork. Curious, respectful, hungry for the angle that reveals the meaning beneath the jargon. Then the conversation took its first unannounced step off the map. Joe leaned forward, elbows on the table, head slightly tilted in that particular way that means he's not fishing for a headline so much as a human moment. "Let me ask you something that's not on the cards," he said. "When did you start believing that building the future meant letting go of parts of the present?" Elon didn't blink. He has a relationship with silence that feels like calculation, but is often just care. He said slowly, "When I realized that we are worse at grieving than we are at inventing." The room gave its first honest quiet, the kind that means a line just found a spine. "Explain that?" Joe said, and he was smiling, but not with his mouth. Elon rested his fingers against the wooden edge of the table, measuring his own thought before it left the dock. He said, "We mourn the wrong things. We mourn comfort more than time. We mourn approval more than possibility. So, when you start to build something that will take 50 years, you have to accept that you'll be criticized by people who live in 5-minute loops." "I love 5-minute loops," Joe shot back, a quick grin to keep the air from hardening. "They do, until they own you." It's hard to describe to someone who wasn't in the room how a shift like that feels. It isn't volume, it's density. Words get heavier. Jokes have to work harder for their oxygen. The first laugh still arrived. This is a show, after all. But it arrived like a bird testing the wind. Joe turned the wheel slightly and the conversation found new water. They talked about social media like two survivors assessing a beach after the tide retreats. Tracks everywhere, some worth following, some worth forgetting, and the occasional footprint that turns out to be your own. Elon said he'd seen outrage packaged like a high-sugar snack, cheap, addictive, and unsustainable past midnight. Joe nodded, that slow nod that says, "I've seen what this machine does to people who can't turn it off." "Okay," Joe said, settling in. "Hard one. You say you want to maximize the rate at which humanity learns. Fine. But you also control platforms that shape what people see and how they speak. How do you carry that without turning into the thing you aim to fix?" Elon exhaled with a half laugh that didn't need a punchline. "If I ever tell you I'm the solution, cut my mic." "Deal. On one condition." "What's that?" "You keep showing up when it's uncomfortable." "Also deal." The show could have floated there, respectful, stimulating, safe, if not for the thing that happens when two people accidentally find the sentence the rest of us came to hear. It arrived when Joe, looking straight at Elon like a man who keeps promises, said, "Let's talk responsibility. Not the corporate version, the human one." Go ahead. And you could hear in the way he said it that he wasn't looking for a path to a neat line. He was looking for a place to tell the truth without folding it for carry-on. You make decisions that tilt gravity. You turn on or off switches that shape speech, money, motion, attention. I know you carry that weight. Anyone can see you carry it, but I also think the world has started outsourcing courage to you. What does Elon think? What will Elon build? What will Elon allow? That's dangerous because even if you're right a lot, we'll forget how to be right without you. The room did the thing it does when a sentence lands harder than expected. It went still without asking anyone's permission. Elon's eyes narrowed, not angry, not even defensive, focused. Engineers, when they respect a problem, don't glare at it. They sit with it long enough to hear where it creaks. Maybe the answer is that I need to be less necessary. And we, Joe said, need to be less lazy. You could bottle that pause and sell it as truth serum. The two men both smiled then, and it wasn't a détente. It was recognition. The first half hour passed like a mile that didn't leave you winded. No fireworks, just a road with the kind of signage you trust when the weather closes in. They moved. AI. Bioengineering, the geometry of risk. Elon spoke the language of possibility the way some people speak of mountains, and Joe served as translator, asking where the footholds were, pointing out the cliffs, and occasionally reminding everyone that the map of an idea is not the same as the territory of a life. When Joe asked about the fear that AI might flatten art into a parade of perfect imitations, Elon surprised him. He said, "I don't want a perfect painting. I want brushstrokes that confess." Confess what? Joe asked. That a person was there. Somewhere in an upstairs office, the producer checking levels forgot to sip her coffee. Down in the booth, a sound engineer took his hand off a fader because he knew there wasn't a better mix than two people refusing to hide behind tempos. They told a couple of stories because humans need stories to keep philosophy from floating away. Joe talked about the way a good gym humbles you without humiliating you, because gravity doesn't care about your reputation. Elon talked about sleeping on factory floors, not as a virtue signal, but as a map of where urgency comes from, when a deadline isn't a line in a spreadsheet, but a promise to 1,000 families with mortgages. They disagreed cleanly about the balance between regulation and velocity. They laughed about memes with the generosity of veterans who have survived worse. The chat rooms exploded and calmed again and exploded again like weather. None of that reached the table. Thank God. The first hour set the table. The next would flip it.
Joe lifted one hand in that small, balletic motion a host uses when he's about to take you somewhere the floor isn't entirely finished. "I've got a story," he said. A young comic DM'd me last week, said he feels like the internet turned his courage into a content farm. Every time he tells the truth, he gets 1,000 brand managers in his mentions telling him to tone it down or repackage it or turn it into a dance. He asked me what to do. I told him to keep getting funnier and braver, in that order. But I also wondered, Joe looked at Elon, whether we built an economy where sincerity can't afford the rent. Elon didn't answer with a plan, he answered with a memory. "When I was a kid," he said, "I loved sci-fi because it wasn't an escape, it was homework. You read it to figure out how to behave when the future arrives without ringing the doorbell. The disappointing part of growing up was discovering that most people read it as a bedtime story." He could have left it there. He didn't. "We've trained ourselves," he said, "to prefer the feeling of having said something brave to the cost of actually doing it." He looked up then, me included. The room, which had already surrendered its right to multitask, gave up breathing for a second time. Joe saw it, let it stand, then pushed gently. "So what's the fix?" Recalibrate the praise, he said. Celebrate the person who changes their mind out loud more than the person who never risks one. Reward the builder who ships something useful over the performer who packages something addictive. Pay for the tool, not the outrage. Sounds like a manifesto, Joe said, smiling. No, Elon said. Sounds like maintenance. The conversation bent toward AI again, but now with an intimacy that had nothing to do with specs. Joe asked whether a model trained on 1 billion borrowed voices could teach courage to a generation that had learned to outsource its sentences. Elon said a machine can mimic conviction but not earn it. Conviction without sacrifice, he added, is cosplay. This was the part of the show where both men could feel a summary trying to assemble itself. Joe refused to let it. He leaned forward. Let me ask the thing people will yell at me for if I don't ask it, he said. You buy platforms, you fire people, you change rules that change lives. You say it's for speed, for mission, for the species. Okay, but there's a person at the end of each of those decisions. How often do you think about them at 3 a.m. when the simulation's quiet? More than the internet assumes. Less than I wish. Explain that. I can't save the world and answer every email. That's not a joke, it's a geometry problem. You pick the angle that gets the most light onto the most surface, you accept the shadows, then you try to remember to walk into them sometimes. Do you regret anything? Joe asked. Sure, Elon said. Name one. Elon's face didn't harden, it softened. The way a person's face softens when a private admission realizes it's about to be born in public. I regret the nights I sent sentences into the world that sounded like courage, but were just adrenaline. Adrenaline is a liar. It tells you you're telling the truth when you're just refusing to sleep. The laughter that followed wasn't laughter. It was relief wearing a costume. Joe didn't fill the space. He let it teach. The chat exploded anyway. Clips were already being clipped by hands that hadn't heard the whole argument yet. But inside the room, the priority was different. Keep the line from breaking. Okay, Joe said softly. Let's do the other thing. What are you stubborn about for good reason? Physics, Elon said, without blinking, and the dignity of building. We keep forgetting that the people who make the lights work are heroes. The electricians, Joe said. The welders, Elon added, the people who lay cable in the rain, the folks who debug your code at 3 a.m. and never get a documentary. We've made fame the currency of meaning. That's a bug. To the welders, Joe said, and the toast felt less like a gag than like a prayer. They talked about speech, not the First Amendment version, the basic human version. How to talk without turning the other person into a straw bale, how to hear a sentence without rating it by retweets. Elon said something then that would end up as 1,000 thumbnails, but deserved better than to be chopped and commodified. If your whole identity fits on a shirt, you're letting the world shrink you. Be more expensive. That was the moment the producer in the other room started shaking her head slowly, like someone watching a magician show you the trap door and still make the rabbit appear. Joe followed with a story about friendship, the way good friends are the ones who can call you at midnight and say, "You're wrong, and I love you," and you hear the love first. Elon nodded like a man who could use more of those calls. He said, "I tend to mistake volume for care. It's a flaw." The second hour gathered steam without raising its voice. They disagreed beautifully about risk. Joe insisted that pushing people too fast guarantees backlash long before it guarantees progress. Elon insisted that waiting for permission is how civilizations lose their nerve and forget how to build ships. There's a cliff on both sides, Joe said. On one side, we become sentimental about yesterday. On the other, we become ruthless about tomorrow. Maybe the trick, Elon said, is to become sentimental about the right things. Craft, courage, the kid who needs to see an adult not panic. Say that last part again, Joe said. The kid, Elon repeated, who needs to see an adult not panic. And then it happened, the 10 seconds that would leave the internet trying to package what shouldn't be packaged. It wasn't a gaffe or a gotcha or a victory lap. It was simpler. Joe asked, "What do you want to be for that kid?" Elon answered, "Not a hero, a hinge." The room went silent, in the precise way silence goes silent when something lands on the table that you didn't know you came to eat. Joe nodded once, a nod that looked almost like a bow. "Explain hinge." "A hinge," Elon said, "doesn't get the credit for the door, but without it, the door is just a heavy idea leaning against the wall." No one spoke for a beat because anything said too quickly would bruise the line. When Joe did reply, he didn't grab for a laugh, he set a marker. "Okay," he said softly, "let's make sure the door doesn't slam." They closed the second hour not with a summary, but with a promise that neither of them would pretend neatness where there was none, that they would keep a human speed where the world demanded an algorithmic one, that they would accept the cost of doing the conversation honestly, even if the easiest clip was the one they didn't give.
The thing about a moment is that it doesn't belong to the moment. It belongs to the hours that follow, to kitchens and cars and gyms and back porches where people test the sentence they just heard against the weight of their own lives. Clips flew, of course they did. One showed Joe's hands, open, like a referee reminding two champions that the rules are simple: stay clean. Another cut to Elon's face at the exact instant the hinge line arrived, eyes steady, mouth a thin line, the frame catching the humanity algorithms always miss. But the real echo didn't live in the clips. It lived in the apparent smallness of what happened next. A teacher in Ohio wrote "Be more expensive" on the whiteboard and told her class it didn't mean you should buy nicer things. It meant your convictions should cost you something, or they weren't convictions. A welder in Houston sent the episode to his daughter with a text that said, "They remembered us tonight." A coder in Bangalore stayed late at the office and fixed a bug without the old dread that his work was invisible. In a comedy club in Manchester, a new comic turned a fragile bit into a brave one because he could hear two men in a studio somewhere arguing, without venom, for the right to be wrong in public and learn out loud. Back at the studio, the table was just a table again. The cables lay heavy, the tally lights slept. Joe walked a quiet set the way a fighter walks a ring when everyone else is gone, seeing ghosts and gratitude where other people see furniture. He sat for a minute in his chair and let the room return to body temperature. He has learned, through craft and mistake, that if you leave too quickly after a moment, it will chase you and make a mess of whatever comes next. He breathed. He stood. He left a note for the crew on a paper towel because sometimes the best notes live on the stuff you don't intend to keep. Good work. More of that. Elon stepped outside into the kind of night Los Angeles offers people who forget to look up. The city hummed like circuitry. His phone, of course, was already a constellation of pings. He didn't open most of them. He watched the car slide down the hill and thought about machines that get better when you don't shout at them. He thought about the kid. He thought about hinges. By morning, the show had become what happens to shows that are more than shows, a test of whether the world prefers heat or light. There were hot takes, some thoughtful, some eager to prove a personality allergy to nuance. There was praise dressed as idolatry, which both men disliked for different reasons. There were criticisms that gave oxygen to ideas that needed it. The smart ones said what the smart ones always say when they're paying attention. The point wasn't agreement. The point was posture. And there were small mercies. A young father wrote that he turned the episode off halfway through because his toddler woke up, and when he came back to it, he didn't skip ahead. He wrote in a comment no one famous would ever read, "I wanted to remember how to listen from the start." A Marine veteran posted that the best part of the night was not a zinger or a reveal. It was a host who didn't rush and a guest who didn't hide. "Feels like how we should talk when it matters," he wrote. "Feels like a room I want to live in." Of course, there was noise. Noise is weather in our time. Someone tried to manufacture a feud where none existed because feuds are efficient content. Someone else cut a fake clip that put words in mouths that didn't say them. It lasted 12 hours. It will last forever in certain corners. That is the internet's business model and its curse. But the core, what happened when two people traded sentences at human speed, survived the edits because some moments refused to be summarized by the least honest part of the audience. Weeks later, Joe found himself at the edge of an MMA mat talking to a young fighter with the wired energy of someone who hasn't yet learned that pacing is a style of courage. The kid said, "I want to shock the world." Joe smiled. "Try this," he said. "Don't shock it. Steady it. Make it remember how to breathe." The kid didn't get it at first. Then he nodded the way all good students nod, slowly, like someone putting down a weight they didn't know they were carrying. Elon visited a factory floor unannounced, not for optics, not for proof, just because. He ran his hands along a rail because sometimes touching the thing reminds you that ideas need metal. He asked a welder how his week was going and listened to the answer without checking the time. Later, when a reporter asked what stuck with him most from the interview, he didn't say the hinge line. He said, "I remembered to answer one email I'd been avoiding." The reporter laughed. "That's it," he said. "That's it. Some hinges are small." You might be waiting for a scandal or a reversal, a headline that crowns a winner. That's not this story. The point wasn't triumph, it was a calibration. Two men who traffic in attention took a night to treat attention like a trust instead of a resource to be mined. They asked for better from each other. They got it. Then they left the room in decent shape for the rest of us. If you want to carry something from that table to yours, carry 3 little practices that don't need a platform to work. Speak at a speed your conscience can keep up with. Earn your voice by spending it on something that outlasts applause. Remember the hinge. If you're the hinge today, don't demand to be the door. If you're the door, don't forget who holds you steady. That's the night. No scandal to archive, no permanent stain to hang in your favorite gallery of outrage, just a room that tried to be better at being a room. 2 people who refused to sprint when a walk would carry more, an echo you can't edit. And if you're still wondering whether anything changed, listen closely to the quiet after the last line. That sound you hear, the one that isn't clapping, isn't jeering, isn't scrolling, is the sound of a future being built at human speed. It begins with the question and ends, with luck, with a door that moves the way it should.